Late with cameras, so you can tell me if everybody's here. We begin. Dmytro Vasylyev, I represent governmental initiative of this around coordination campaign, and today with us we have experts who know the topic of decentralization of the government, and I will introduce them and I will tell you details about what we are going to talk about. There's Ivan Lukeria, Reanimation package of reforms, and Oleksandr Moskaliuk, law expert, PhD in law, and Serhiy Loboiko, Center for Innovations Development, and Kyiv-Mohyla Academy project leader at Democracy People. What are we talking about? We are talking about reform and decentralization of the government, although the word the reform is quite used here. But we are working for that because we, as citizens of Ukraine, we are very interested in the realization of reforms, and we still hope that in the government and in the parliament there is a commitment. So a new vice premier Zumko, he told, as reforms don't stop, they just develop, and we listened about the commitment of the Speaker of the Parliament, who's the Vice Prime Minister, who initiated that reform, and so there is a new movement. And Volodymyr Grosman, he also told that he has personal commitment, and it's good that he holds the position which will allow to pass all necessary laws to introduce reforms, and there are a lot of them, and the most difficult changes in the constitution of Ukraine. But now we'll speak about personification of reforms. Some time ago, there was a Vice Prime Minister Grosman. He personalized the movement to realize reforms and implement reforms, and the society and the government was understanding that he was responsible. At present, there is a question: who is responsible for reforms? We were trying to answer that question, and we decided to look at international experience, and my colleagues will speak about the experience of Poland and Slovakia, because it was successful from the point of view of reforms. And there was also a figure who personally had responsibility for reforms, and but that figure was not political position. That was an expert scientist, academic person who took responsibility for implementation of reforms, and that was a safeguard from a danger when the government could change and a person could stay and implement reforms further. If we speak about Ukraine and if we use that experience, there will be a question: is it important for that person to be Ukrainian? Because we will consider functions of that person and experience one must have. Let's look with a fresh eye. Maybe it should not be a Ukrainian. I would like to give the floor to my colleagues, and let's look at Slovakia experience. Thank you for your attention. As to Polish experience, why Poland could be for Ukraine as an example of decentralization and reforms of local self-governance. First of all, we have to say that Poland is that country among the rest of the countries of the EU that is the closest to Ukraine from the point of view of population and territory. Both Ukraine and Poland they are big in terms of territory and population. Second important factor which requires to use Polish experiences, because this is the experience which lasted for long. After the reform of local self-governance in Poland, and now they have some negative trends related, negative experience related to reforms, and they are mentioned by Polish politicians reforms, and they can tell about that. And there are several other moments, because Poland is that country like Ukraine. It has socialistic past and as a socialist system of local self-governance. And of course, solution getting out of the system that was very difficult for Poland. And from the point of view of such an index as age structure of the population, Poland looks very similar to Ukraine. If we take features common to Poland, all those features are common for Ukraine. That's why any Polish reform, of course, we should understand that it is relative, because we cannot make it absolute, but that reform will be useful for Ukraine.
However, this reform will be useful for Ukrainian reforms and conditions and the problems that minuses that manifested themselves during the reform. The major of them is that at the level of the second administrative and territorial unit, which is a district in our system, the Poles have seen the inefficiency of the system that they've been implementing, and they are trying to reform it even now. And here we have to say that the process of reform has to be a comprehensive process, because the Polish reform lasted for more than 10 years, and they have adopted 90 laws during the first stage of the reform and then 150 during the second stage. So the comprehensive reform has also to touch upon budget reforming and planning reform and the transfer of authority from higher levels to lower levels. In this case, the reform may become a quality reform. Hello, everybody. First of all, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that this reform, the decentralization, hides, on the one hand, a fantastic latent potential that there is in Ukraine for great progress, for opening huge potential that we have on the grassroots level. On the other hand, it does contain high risks that to some extent slow down the political decision to start its implementation. However, now we have all the preconditions to launch the reform, and we have to, at the very start, define the criteria and mechanisms about the manager, the person who has to embody the process of facilitation of this reform. And here we have a very disputable question whether this should be a Ukrainian or a foreigner who does not depend on our realities. And it is evident that even if this is a foreigner, then this person has to very quickly gain the authority and prestige among local elites. And this person has to ignite and inspire people, irrespectively of which milieu they represent. A person who would inspire local elites to open up the potential hidden in this reform. We can compare this to, a social innovator, because we have a certain skepticism about assuming responsibility and starting to change some evident things. You can see houses with leaders and without leaders in the same district. Maybe they have the form of condominium where people have pictures hanging in the lobby of their house, and where everybody uses the internet, where they come together for tea parties, and next door there's a house where everything is as it used to be during the Soviet times. So it is very important to make sure that we can change. And this is one of the challenges for a person who will be selected for this position. This cannot be just an official. This cannot be a person who represents the result of another political contract or agreement. And we should also think about the possibility that this person should be a person who have manifested themselves well during Maidan, because Maidan has opened up new vistas that our neighbors have not even dreamt about. So one of these evolutionary ways that offers an opportunity to look in a different way at this position could be the elements of electronic democracy that would provide local leaders with an opportunity to demonstrate in the real-time regime their trust in the leader who will be responsible for this reform. Thank you for your attention. Hello, colleagues. I will hark back to Jerzy Revutsky, the father of the local self-government reform in Poland, that this reform has the more enemies than anyone. And this also touches upon the health ministry and the finance ministry because it pertains to the reform of budget and the Ministry of Education, because this changes the system of managing the higher educational establishments, and not only this. And this also requires the change of the structure of state administration. And this was the name for this reform in Slovakia and Poland, not only local self-government, but also national structures. And there's also a danger of, for instance, tying this reform to a political figure, a personification, like we had this in the case of Volodymyr Groysman, who was deputy prime minister, and now he is head of the parliament. And Slovakia found the way to deal with this because they appointed a special person who was responsible for this reform, and this person was Viktor Nezhnyansky, not a politician, an intellectual, rather a technical person who was engaged in communication organizing communication between all stakeholders, local self-government and national government and public organizations. So they agreed their positions, and as a result, in the year 2000, they found a single approach to this. And the reform lasted for 6 years, and Viktor Nezhnyansky was appointed just for the period of effecting the reform, without any political ambitions. As we have a similar situation, we see the way out in creating a position of such a responsible person in the government, and whose main functions are going to be: this person takes part in sessions of the Cabinet of Ministers and has the right to vote on the reform issues. A special office has been created for this person, let's call it secretariat. They work out different concepts and agree them and then submit to the government. And the implementation of the decisions that were prepared, it goes in such a way. The responsible person submits this to the Cabinet of Ministers, and then the Prime Minister, as a political person, submits it to the session of the Cabinet of Ministers, and this person can be appointed by a resolution of the Cabinet of Ministers. The candidature submitted by the Prime Minister, and they are appointed only for the duration of the reform. First of all, this has to be not a political person, have no political ambitions, a technical person. On the other hand, it has to be equally removed from all the stakeholders, political parties, local self-government, parliament. However, they have to be a recognized authority, moral authority, and they have to be accepted in every office. They have to have an experience in working in government or local self-government. This person has to have a vision how the reform should proceed, as the reform of local self-governments requires a clear-cut vision of what sort of country we should have in 2020 or 2025, because of course this reform cannot last for just 1 year, because there's a change of many approaches. In Ukraine, we can talk first of all about the appointment of a person from abroad, and this could be Viktor Nezhnyansky from Slovakia, or Jerzy Revutsky, the father of Polish reforms. Also, the experience of Lithuania is interesting in this respect, where they also had a technical person in the government. In Ukraine, the father of the Ukrainian vision of this reform is Anatoly Tkachuk, the director of the Institute of Civil Society, a person who has been engaged in working out the reform plans for many years. He has quite an authority between associations of local self-governments. He was an advisor to Vice Prime Minister Groisman, and he is regarded well in many milieus. However, during the appointment of such a person, we cannot repeat the mistake like we saw with the person responsible for lustration, when the public responsibility was put with one person, and this person was not given any leverage to perform the reform. In Slovakia, the reform happened because the government was ready to conduct the reform, and the appointee has agreed and drawn out and submitted to the government all the concepts. And in 2001, the government of Slovakia changed the constitution, and they also passed more than 20 draft laws, some of them very complicated, like the law on administrative structure, the budgetary law, providing for the stability of revenue of local budgets. So only if the government is ready to hold the reform, then we can talk about a special office of a person responsible for this within the structure of the Cabinet of Ministers.
Thank you. I was listening to you and I thought it's a great moment to set up administrative with these opportunities, administrators, and there should be a document, and it should be given to Groisman. So it's a great moment, a very good moment. So I ask you, as representative of RPR, and you have experience, very positive experience, how to possible set up a working group and do it as quick as possible to the Parliament and Cabinet of Ministers to build the administrative budget. It was about Tkachuk, Anatoly Tkachuk. He's one of the best candidates. Everybody is talking about that, but we should not focus only on one person. We should look at others, and maybe not only Ukrainian citizens could work on this position. We have experience of using foreigners, and as I know, Anatoly doesn't want to take responsibility for that. He is time for questions. Well, there is no concrete question. Maybe you would like to make some comments, please. I will just make it clear, and I will repeat myself that we can speak about creation of such a person if the President of Parliament and Cabinet Minister have the will to run reforms. To take responsibility does mean to have all administrative tools to introduce reforms. This reform requires changes of sectors of government. Ministry of Finances, Ministry of Healthcare, Ministry of Education are involved, and different institutions and agencies. This reform has a lot of opposition on the local level. From healthcare, principals of schools, all these positions should be agreed. Such a person can agree on these. He can bring a united position to the cabinet of ministers. If the government has that will, that's a huge condition, the only huge condition, big condition. Also, I would like to say a couple of words when this reform can be implemented. To implement this reform, and Polish experience shows it requires four factors. The first one we know well about, and that is a political will. Without political will, it doesn't matter how it happens, it's impossible to realize any implementing reform. The second factor, we need to find those experts who will be responsible for this reform, and they will set the strategy of the reform and goals and means that will help to implement this reform. And the third very important thing is social support, public support. Why Polish experience is successful? Why they achieved such results? Because there was social support, including mass media. And the fourth factor, there must be trainings for those people who will introduce this reform. These are things that are required. One more aspect, as persons. The main criteria is the criteria of knowledge about the administrative reform. And of course, Polish experience very good because it was the academic people took responsibility. They were not dreaming about political goals. People who for more than 10 years they developed that concept. For 10 years they implied it. They applied it and they can share their experience, and that's what we observe because many Yerzhy he visited Ukraine, and advantages and disadvantages. That's the topic. That's the topic he spoke about to Ukrainian politicians. Thank you, colleagues. Judging by lots of questions, this topic probably is not interesting or it's very complicated. It's a joke. In the end, I would like to focus on the following. Someone we discuss should be intellectual, should be a mediator, a visionary, and evangelist in a good sense, like a success story owner. We can change this country. I would like to draw attention that this reform, it's clear that it changes the pyramid we have. Instead of Kyiv and center, the economic centers and taking investment decisions that will happen on the local level. Like in Switzerland, you go to different concrete villages, and you agree with local leaders of communities why you want to make business there. You discuss tax rates and conditions that they provide from local government, and that from the point of view of business, and from the point of view of citizens, and that's a comfort of infrastructure, economic life we will have on the local level. And the challenge is these leaders must be found local, and we need a critical mass of them. So think how you can participate in the process and how you can involve people, because if there is inertia on the grassroots level, it doesn't matter what kind of genius we have. Steve Jobs, who can run that ministry or that position? That will not change anything. We need to involve people. Thank you for your attention. We have some time, and finally, I would like to remind the words of Volodymyr Groysman. He said half a year ago, decentralization, that is reform number one, he told. These are not just words. That's a reform, and which is important for the rest of the reforms in Ukraine. What reforms are important for us? Financial, moral, energy, social, healthcare, education, etc. Why? Because I support what my colleagues told, that the pyramid has changed. So then powers from the center, from Soviet system, they're given to the local level. So more powers and resources in the end, money, are received by towns, cities, communities, villages, and they become more authorized to solve local issues and to decide on priorities what should be developed on the local level. So a mayor, city mayor, will not run to the treasury in Kyiv and ask money for to repair the road. He will have that money. He can make a decision with the local council, and the local council will appoint the executive committee, and they will make decisions that will be responsible for realization of the plans. And local communities will decide what kind of schools to finance, how unite schools, how to bring them together, with what schools their kids will visit in a town or village. It's not the decision of in Kyiv, like under Azarov, and he was criticized by local people, and so on, including energy sector. We have monopolies, but there is a decision of central government how to start this process of heating, whether or not, and when, how to provide coal to thermal stations. Experience of Poland shows, with the same number of population and approximately the same territory, they use 15 billion cubic meters of gas, and we use 50. It's because they make decisions on the local level, and how to modernize their houses for us not to have networks underground that go from central thermal power stations. These are big issues, and that's why this reform is number one. That's why it's very important to have someone who will personalize his authorities and responsibility, and who would have that personal commitment to implement this reform, because success of the country depends how we carry it out. No question? Thank you very much. There's no question.